Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. How deep is the Qatar infiltration into Netanyahu's circle edition? So, there have been a lot of revelations over the last 2 weeks over contacts between Netanyahu's closest aides and now investigators into the October 7th massacre and the Qatari government, which has been, as we know, the major financer and supporter of Hamas for many years. And that leads us to the question of how much influence does Qatar have over Israeli policy? How much does Netanyahu understand what Qatar is trying to get him to do and why? How much corruption is involved here, and how much this has taken away from the autonomy and the ability of the Israeli government to serve the national interest. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone but Netanyahu, if he even has the answers to all of this, but I do have a lot of facts that have come to light recently that make me raise a lot of questions about what's going on with the Israeli government and its contact with Qatar. So here's a little bit of what we know. Since 2014, Qatar has provided well over $1 billion in reconstruction funds and stipends for Gaza that we know of. Qatar transferred around $30 million per month to Gaza directly since 2012, and we know that that money went to Qatar, to Hamas. Hamas built tunnels and bought rockets and arms and buttressed its rule with it in general, and that Netanyahu approved of and uh, was the one who oversaw the transfer of what was basically suitcases of cash coming in every month into Qatar. Now, there are strategic reasons for that transfer of money. The IDF said that that money is needed in order to keep quiet in Gaza, keep stability in Gaza. At that point, the what Israelis call the concept, the conceptia, was that Hamas was turning into a semi-responsible sovereign that was controlling other groups like Islamic Jihad and ISIS and other threats, and it was better to work with them than to work with um, the other splinter groups there, and so on and so forth. There's also been a political rationale for this, one that some members of Netanyahu's government have openly discussed, especially Bezalel Smotrich. The idea being that if Israel divides and conquers between the PA and Hamas, then the Palestinians will be weakened and won't be able to aspire to a state. In fact, Bezalel Smotrich called Hamas in Gaza a strategic asset to Israel. Netanyahu's never gone as far as to say that, but his approach to Hamas and his approach to the PA have shown that he's playing a divide and conquer game, certainly before October 7th, and many of his critics believe since, and that stands behind his seeming inability to remove Hamas from power. So you have a political reason and you have a strategic reason. But then we're starting to see a third reason, a financial reason, corrupt reason. Qatari money may have been buying the influence to allow them to play that role, to strengthen Hamas in a way that ultimately led to October 7th. So let's look at some of the evidence. Let's start with an article that came out today in Haaretz about Brigadier General Eli Ben-Meir. Eli Ben-Meir used to be the head of the research department in Amman, which is the military intelligence branch of the IDF. But since he owns a PR company, or he's one of the owners of a PR company, that PR company has worked on behalf of Qatar to launch a campaign that markets the Gulf country as a quote, bedrock of peace and stability, end quote. And pieces like that have appeared in the Israeli press and elsewhere. Now, this becomes a serious conflict of interest because he has been appointed to investigate the conduct of the Southern Command being the command that is responsible for Gaza during the October 7th attacks and the failures that led to it. As we know, and we'll discuss a little further, Netanyahu has tried to block a independent commission. This inquiry is supposed to replace that. Yet the individual in charge of it, or at least in charge of an important part of it, worked for Qatar and has taken Qatari money. Since Qatari influence and Qatari money going to Hamas is a major part of the problem, this creates a conflict of interest. And of course, the question that rises in my mind and in the minds of others is, was he appointed intentionally with the knowledge that he had this conflict of interest and therefore might sweep connections to Qatar under the rug? Now, on its own, that may seem a little circumstantial, but these contacts continue. A few weeks ago, we had revelations in several Israeli media outlets that Eli Feldstein had also been working for Qatar and promoting its PR. But what was particularly shocking about what Eli Feldstein had done is that he was doing it during the war. Now, if you don't know who Eli Feldstein is, that's the individual who has gone to jail for leaking classified documents regarding the hostages to several foreign outlets in Germany and in England. He's the one who leaked the document that said hostages were being sneaked out into Egypt, which turned out not to be true. A note that was said to be from Sinwar that turned out not to be from Sinwar, and all sorts of other things to justify the fact that Netanyahu had not gone to a hostage deal in July, and then several hostages had died as a result, and he was trying to minimize the fallout from that. Well, now we know that while Feldstein was doing all this, he was also receiving a large amount of money from Qatar. And he was receiving that money in order to improve Qatar's image in Israel as it had taken a hit, understandably, by October 7th and by the not particularly favorable role that Qatar had played in the hostage release negotiations from the Israeli perspective. Several Israeli journalists have reported that Feldstein contacted them and gave them stories that made Qatar look good. The ones who talked about this said that they did not accept those stories. I am sure that other journalists who have not come forward did. The fact that we had someone working in Netanyahu's office on Qatari money after October 7th and after we know about their involvement in financing Hamas in the lead up to October 7th leads to even more questions. Questions that may be answered now that Feldstein is indicted and may go to jail for many, many years. But will the Qatari angle be properly investigated? It's not clear if law enforcement and the courts can do that properly without the full cooperation of the security forces in that regard. And the question is, will anyone try to block that from happening? But that's not the only incident that we have. Two further close advisors of Netanyahu, possibly his two closest advisors of all, Jonathan Ulrich and Israel Einhorn, worked for the PR company that Ben Meir runs. They, quote, created a campaign in 2022 to improve the image of the main ally and supplier of funds to Hamas. Yes, Qatar. Their campaign was a large and expensive campaign, must have been significantly more expensive than the one that Feldstein was involved in, and it surrounded the 2022 World Cup. If you remember, in the 2022 World Cup, Qatar managed to get the rights to host the World Cup despite its horrific human rights record. And it then used the World Cup to try to improve its image around the world. It's very clear that Qatar is incredibly worried about its image. It does all of this dirty work in supporting terrorism, um, trafficking slaves, and so on and so forth into their country, then tries to cover it up through PR campaigns. And of course, it also, more pertinent to our conversation, supports terrorism around the world, and particularly with Hamas. According to documents leaked to Haaretz, the goal of their campaign was to, quote, reduce negative discourse about Qatar by 1.3%, while simultaneously increasing the positive narrative by 1.7%, a coldly calculated approach to global perception management of Qatar in their many scandals. So we have here intimate financial connections between Netanyahu's office and Qatar while Qatar was funding Hamas and after October 7th as well. None of these deals lead directly to Netanyahu. So, best case scenario, his office was steering him in a pro-Qatari direction without his knowledge. Um, However, there is also some evidence of links between Qatar and Netanyahu himself that need to be further explored by the Israeli media and the international media. Uh, Netanyahu, his son, and his wife tend to stay almost exclusively in hotels run by Qatar, owned by Qatar, when they're in the United States and sometimes in other countries as well. We know that the Netanyahu family doesn't like to pay for their own stuff, and that's how they've gotten into trouble with various corruption charges. Is there a chance that Qatar is paying for various benefits, hotels, spas, etc., for the Netanyahu couple as part of this arrangement whereby Qatar has all this influence in Gaza and Israel allows it to maintain that influence? Um, we know that Qatar has a long history of using money as a means of persuasion. They have one of the highest per capita GDPs in the world, over 93,000 per person per year. And Dr. Ariel Admoni, a Middle East researcher at Bar Ilan University, said the Qatari rial doesn't just buy infrastructure, it buys influence. And some examples are, for example, David Beckham, who is the sports ambassador for Qatar and receives around $200 million from them. We also know how they bought the World Cup. In 2014, leaked documents revealed that FIFA Vice President Jack Warner received $2 million directly after Qatar's World Cup bid, with 1.2 million transferred immediately and the remainder sent to his son. The international governing football body was so alarmed that in May 2011 they suspended two senior officials for helping Qatar, quote, buy the tournament. In the United States, Senator Bob Menendez, who was one of the most important lawmakers in foreign policy, was investigated for allegedly acting as a foreign agent of Qatar and of other countries as well, including Egypt. In one remarkable instance, Qatar's investment fund purchased a Manhattan hotel in 2023 for a staggering $623 million. And that involved, among other people, Stephen Witkoff, who is the Trump envoy to the Middle East. So there is a long history of Hamas, Qatar buying influence through its financial capabilities. And there's strong connections between Qatar and the inner circle of Netanyahu. The evidence of the connection is all there. What we don't have is the depth of the influence this has on policy. But it's hard to imagine that it has no influence on policy whatsoever. And this raises a lot of questions about Netanyahu's insistence on avoiding a commission to investigate his part, or in general, the unfolding of events leading to October 7th. Netanyahu's insisted that he wants to beat Hamas before there's any investigation. but he also has not taken the military steps necessary to defeat Hamas, such as occupying the entire strip. The fact that Netanyahu has allowed Hamas to continue to exist in Gaza and has also taken a large amount of money indirectly um, from Qatar raises a lot of questions, especially since he's publicly told the media that Qatar serves Hamas, which makes his constant engagement with Qatar and Qatari interests very questionable. Netanyahu knows that they serve terror interests and still hasn't moved to divorce himself from their influence. Why? Is it possible that Netanyahu is blocking this investigation not only because he's afraid that it will show his ineptitude, but also because it will show some depth of corruption that led to his inability to stop October 7th? I'm not saying that Qatar bribed Netanyahu into allowing October 7th to happen. That seems very unlikely. But what is possible is that they led him down the garden path for years, knowing that it would lead to some sort of attack, knowing that they were undermining Israeli security, that Netanyahu wasn't as vigilant as he should have been because of all the money coming in. That's something that has to be investigated. The only way to investigate that is through an independent commission of inquiry, one that Netanyahu is blocking, one that the government has voted against convening, even though the Attorney General said it's absolutely essential that it happen, and that not only is it necessary for accountability, but also in order to protect Israel from the ICC and from the ICJ. This must be investigated. And it's another reason why prime ministers should not be people who are under investigation for corruption, because people who are that corruptible can't be trusted with the security of a country, especially a country that's under as much threat as the state of Israel. Okay, that's the end of this episode. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Consider signing up for my Substack and listening to my History of the Land of Israel podcast. I'll be here again very soon, the next time something interesting happens.